My MIL gave my therapy dog to the pound while I was hospitalized. The discharge papers crinkled in my shaking hands as I fumbled with my apartment keys. After 6 days in a psychiatric ward at St. Mary's, all I wanted was to feel Cooper's warm fur against my face and hear his tail thumping against our hardwood floor. My golden retriever had been my lifeline for 3 years, ever since the accident that killed my sister Emma and left me with PTSD so severe I couldn't drive for 18 months. Cooper? I called, pushing open the door. Baby, I'm home. Silence. My heart rate spiked immediately, that familiar fight-or-flight response flooding my system. Cooper always met me at the door. Always. Even when I'd only been gone for 20 minutes to grab groceries, he'd be there wiggling and whining with excitement. Cooper. I dropped my bag and rushed through our small apartment, checking every room twice. His bed was gone. His food bowls, gone. The rope toy he'd had since he was a puppy, gone. My phone rang. David. Hey babe, how are you feeling? I'm so sorry I couldn't pick you up, but this deposition ran long and... Where's Cooper? My voice came out sharp, panicked. Silence on the other end. Then, what do you mean? I mean, where's my dog, David? He's not here. None of his stuff is here. That's impossible. Mom said she'd check on him every day while you were. He stopped abruptly. My blood turned to ice. Your mother was here? In our apartment? Sarah, I gave her the spare key. I thought. I was working 16-hour days on the Morrison case, and I couldn't get over there as much as I wanted, so I asked her to help with Cooper. She loves dogs. Margaret Whitmore had never loved anything in her 64 years except control and appearances. She'd made it crystal clear from day one that she thought her successful attorney son had married beneath him when he chose a damaged barista with trauma issues. I was already dialing animal control with trembling fingers. The phone rang 4 times before someone picked up. Animal Services, this is Jessica. Hi, I need to check if my dog was brought in. He's missing and I think someone might have. Name and description? Cooper Richardson. Golden Retriever, 4 years old, about 70 pounds. He has a blue collar with tags, and he's a registered therapy animal. I heard typing. Then a pause that lasted too long. Ma'am, we did have a Golden Retriever brought in 5 days ago. But according to our records, the person who dropped him off said he was a stray with no identification. 5 days ago. The day after I'd been admitted. That's impossible. He has tags with his name and my phone number. And his therapy dog certification card is attached to his collar. More typing. I'm looking at the intake form. It says the animal was brought in without any identification. The reporting party claimed it had been wandering their neighborhood for several days. Who brought him in? I already knew, but I needed to hear it. A Margaret Whitmore. She left her contact information in case of questions. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. Through the speaker, I could hear Jessica asking if I was still there, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Margaret had stripped Cooper of his collar, his tags, his identity, and delivered him to animal control like garbage. My therapy dog. My lifeline. The one thing that kept me tethered when the flashbacks hit and the world tilted sideways. And she'd made sure there would be no way to trace him back to me. I scrambled for the phone, my hand shaking so violently I could barely grip it. Jessica? Are you still there? Yes, ma'am, I'm here. Are you the owner of this animal? Yes. He's my registered therapy dog. I have all his paperwork, his registration, vet records, everything. Where is he now? I need to come get him immediately. The silence stretched too long again. When Jessica spoke, her voice was gentler, careful. Ma'am, I'm so sorry. The Golden Retriever was euthanized yesterday morning. Day 5 is our standard hold period for strays without identification. The words hit me like a physical blow. I doubled over, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Cooper was dead. My Cooper, who slept curled against my back every night when the nightmares came. Who would press his 70-pound body against my legs when I had panic attacks in grocery stores. Who had literally saved my life more times than I could count. Ma'am? Ma'am, are you okay? I couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. The apartment walls were closing in, and I could hear the screech of metal on metal, the sound from the accident, the sound that haunted my dreams. Emma's voice calling my name right before impact. But Cooper wasn't here to ground me. Cooper was never going to be here again. When I finally found my voice, it came out as a whisper. I need copies of all the paperwork. The intake form, everything. Of course. I'm so sorry for your loss. This kind of miscommunication it's tragic. Miscommunication. As if Margaret had accidentally forgotten to mention the bright blue collar with 2 tags and a laminated therapy dog card. As if she'd somehow missed Cooper's name and my phone number printed in bold letters. I managed to get the Animal Services address before hanging up. Then I called David back. Sarah, thank God. What did they say? She killed him. My voice was flat, empty. Your mother killed my dog. What are you talking about? That's insane. Mom would never. She stripped off his collar and told animal control he was a stray. They euthanized him yesterday. I heard David's sharp intake of breath. That can't be right. There has to be some mistake. The intake form has her signature, David. She gave them her contact information. This wasn't a mistake. I'm coming over. No. The word came out harder than I intended. I need you to call your mother first. I need you to ask her what happened to Cooper's collar. Ask her why she told them he was a stray. Sarah, you're not thinking clearly right now. You just got out of the hospital and... Don't. I cut him off. Don't you dare tell me I'm not thinking clearly. Your mother murdered my therapy dog, and you're already making excuses for her. That's not what I'm doing. Then call her. Right now. Ask her where Cooper's collar is. I hung up before he could respond. My phone buzzed immediately with a text, *, please don't do anything rash. I love you, *. Rash. Like being upset that my emotional support animal was dead was an overreaction. Like Margaret's decades of passive-aggressive cruelty toward me was just a personality quirk I should learn to tolerate. I sat on our couch, the couch where Cooper used to sprawl across my lap during movie nights, and stared at the empty space where his bed should be. Margaret had been thorough. She'd taken every trace of him, erased every sign that he'd ever existed. But she'd made one mistake. She'd used her real name at animal control, and that meant there was a paper trail. Margaret Whitmore was about to learn that the weak girl she'd been tormenting for 4 years had more fight in her than she'd ever imagined. My phone rang while I was sitting in the animal services parking lot, staring at the intake form through blurry eyes. Margaret's signature was a sharp, precise scrawl at the bottom, * Margaret E. Whitmore, 847-555-0293 *. Right above her lie about Cooper being a stray animal, no identification visible. Sarah. David's voice was strained. I talked to my mother. I waited. She says Cooper got loose somehow. She went to check on him Tuesday morning and found the apartment door open. She thinks maybe the maintenance guy left it unlocked after fixing Mrs. Chen's leak upstairs. And his collar? She doesn't know. She looked everywhere for him, drove around the neighborhood for hours. When she found him 3 days later, he didn't have any tags. The lie was so smooth, so reasonable. If I hadn't seen this intake form, if I hadn't heard Jessica read Margaret's own words back to me, I might have even believed it. David, she told Animal Control that Cooper had been wandering her neighborhood. She lives in Westbrook. That's 12 miles from our apartment. Maybe he wandered that far? Dogs can travel pretty far when they're scared. I closed my eyes. Even now, faced with documented proof of his mother's cruelty, David was bending himself into pretzels to avoid seeing the truth. She signed a form stating she'd been feeding him for several days before bringing him in. If she'd been feeding him, why didn't she call me? Why didn't she call you? Sarah, I know you're hurting right now. Stop. My voice came out harder than I'd intended. Just stop. Your mother hated Cooper because he helped me. She hated that I had something that made me stronger, that made me less dependent on you controlling my life. That's not fair. Isn't it? When was the last time you stood up to her about anything? When she told your sister not to invite me to her wedding? When she accidentally scheduled that family dinner on my birthday? When she told the Hendersons that my PTSD was just attention-seeking? Silence. I have the paperwork, David. I have her signature on a legal document where she lied to government officials. She committed fraud. You're talking about pressing charges against my mother over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. Cooper was dead, and David was calling it a misunderstanding. I'll be home later, I said, and hung up. I sat in my car for another 20 minutes, reading the intake form over and over. Then I opened my laptop and started researching. By the time I drove home, I had 3 pages of notes and a plan that was both terrible and perfect. Margaret Whitmore worked as a paralegal at Brennan, Cross & Associates, one of the most prestigious elder law firms in the state. She'd been there for 18 years, ever since David's father died and left her with a mortgage she could barely afford on a secretary's salary. She'd clawed her way up to her current position through sheer determination and what she called attention to detail. I'd always wondered how she managed to afford her house in Westbrook, her weekly manicures, and her BMW on a paralegal salary. Especially since David had mentioned more than once that the firm was struggling, too many partners, too much overhead, not enough high-paying clients. But elder law was lucrative if you knew how to work the system. Elderly clients with limited family oversight, complex estate planning, power of attorney documents that required careful handling of funds. Margaret was meticulous about everything. David always joked that she kept receipts from 1987. If she was skimming money from client accounts, and I was becoming more certain by the hour that she was, she'd have left a trail. And I was going to find it. I spent the next 3 days planning while David worked late, avoiding the conversation we both knew was coming. He'd tried twice to bring up the Cooper situation, his exact words, but I'd shut him down each time. I wasn't ready to hear more excuses for his mother's cruelty, and I definitely wasn't ready to tell him what I was planning. Margaret's weakness had always been her pride. She loved bragging about her job, dropping hints about the important clients she handled, the complex estates she managed. At David's birthday dinner last month, she'd spent 20 minutes detailing how she'd saved the Pemberton family thousands in probate fees through her innovative filing strategies. What she'd actually described sounded like tax evasion, but David had just smiled and nodded like she'd cured cancer. I started with public records. Margaret's house had been purchased in 2019 for $340,000, steep for a paralegal salary, but manageable with David's father's life insurance. But the renovations told a different story. New kitchen in 2020, $45,000 according to the permit. Bathroom remodel in 2021, $18,000. New roof, new windows, professional landscaping. Easily another $60,000 in improvements. Her BMW was a 2021 model, lease payments probably around $800 monthly. Add her mortgage, utilities, property taxes, and general living expenses, and she needed at least $6,000 monthly just to break even. Paralegal salaries in our area topped out around $65,000 annually. The math didn't work unless she had another income source. I drove to Brennan, Cross & Associates Thursday afternoon, parking across the street with a clear view of the employee entrance. Margaret emerged at exactly 5:47 p.m. She'd always been obsessively punctual, carrying her oversized leather purse and a manila folder. She tucked the folder under her arm before getting into her BMW, but not before I'd seen confidential attorney-client privilege stamped across the front. Taking client files home wasn't necessarily illegal, but it was unusual. Most firms had strict policies about confidential documents leaving the office. I followed her to First National Bank on Maple Street. She used the drive-thru, handing the teller what looked like a check and a deposit slip. The transaction took less than 2 minutes, but she sat in the parking lot afterward, making notes in a small black notebook. Margaret Whitmore was many things, but disorganized wasn't one of them. If she was stealing from clients, she was documenting every penny. That night, I created a fake Gmail account under the name Jennifer Walsh and spent 4 hours crafting the perfect email to the State Bar Association's ethics hotline. I didn't send it, not yet. But I wanted the language perfect when the time came. Asterisk, I am writing to report suspected financial misconduct by a paralegal at Brennan, Cross and Associates. Based on my observations, I believe Margaret E. Whitmore may be misappropriating funds from elderly clients through unauthorized access to estate accounts. I have documented evidence of unusual financial activity and am willing to provide additional information to investigators. Asterisk. Simple, direct, impossible to ignore. The State Bar took elder abuse seriously, especially financial exploitation. One complaint would trigger an audit that would examine every client file Margaret had touched in the past 5 years. My phone buzzed with a text from David, asterisk, working late again. Mom wants to have dinner this weekend to talk about everything. I think it would be good for you two to clear the air. Asterisk. Clear the air. Like Margaret and I had simply had a misunderstanding about whose turn it was to pick up the dinner check. I typed back, tell her I'd love to hear her explain what happened to Cooper's collar. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, asterisk, can we please try to move forward? For us, asterisk. For us. As if forgiving his mother for murdering my therapy dog was some small compromise I should make for the sake of our relationship. As if Cooper's life and death was just collateral damage in Margaret's ongoing campaign to prove I wasn't good enough for her son. I deleted David's text without responding and opened my laptop. If Margaret wanted to have dinner and clear the air, she was welcome to do it from a jail cell. But first, I needed to get inside that office. The opportunity came Friday morning when David mentioned that Margaret's firm was hosting their annual charity gala at the Riverside Country Club. Mom's been planning this thing for months, he said, not looking up from his coffee. It's some big fundraiser for literacy programs. She'll be there all evening making sure everything's perfect. Perfect. Margaret would be occupied for at least 6 hours, probably longer if she stayed for the inevitable post-event cleanup and networking. The office would be empty except for security, and I happened to know from her previous bragging that Brennan, Cross and Associates used the same outdated keycard system that my old job at the medical billing company had used, the kind where employee cards worked 24/7 unless specifically disabled. I'd seen Margaret's keycard dozens of times, dangling from the retractable badge holder on her purse. Navy blue with the firm's logo, her photo, and most importantly, the access number printed in small font along the bottom, BC 7749. That afternoon, I drove to Office Depot and bought a basic badge holder and lanyard. Then I went home and spent 3 hours with Photoshop, recreating Margaret's keycard using her LinkedIn profile photo and the firm's website logo. The access number was the crucial part. Most keycard readers only scanned the magnetic strip, but having the correct number visible would help sell the illusion if anyone questioned me. The finished product wasn't perfect, but it would pass a casual glance. I laminated it, attached it to the lanyard, and practiced my explanation. Asterisk, hi, I'm Margaret's assistant. She asked me to grab some files for the Morrison case since she'll be at the gala all evening. Asterisk. Simple, plausible, forgettable. At 7:30 p.m., I parked 2 blocks from the Brennan building and walked to the employee entrance. The security guard barely looked up from his newspaper when I waved my fake keycard at the reader. The light flashed green. Apparently their system was even less sophisticated than I'd hoped. Working late tonight? He asked, glancing at my card. Margaret forgot some files for tomorrow's depositions, I said, letting a touch of exasperation creep into my voice. You know how she gets when everything isn't perfectly organized. He chuckled. Don't I ever? 3rd floor, right? Right. I headed for the elevator, my heart hammering against my ribs. The building felt different at night, shadows longer, sounds echoing strangely. But I'd made it past the first hurdle. Margaret's office was exactly what I'd expected, meticulously organized, with color-coded filing systems and a desk so clean it could have been a showroom display. Her computer was password protected, but I wasn't here for digital files. Margaret was old school. She trusted paper records more than hard drives. The filing cabinet behind her desk was locked, but the key was taped under her desk drawer, because Margaret's obsession with control meant she'd never trust building maintenance with access to her files. Inside, I found what I was looking for, a section labeled Personal Financial Records that had no business existing in a law firm filing system. Bank statements going back 3 years. Deposit slips for amounts that didn't match her salary. And most damning, a leather-bound ledger with entries in Margaret's precise handwriting, dates, client names, and dollar amounts. Pemberton Estate, $2,400, consulting fee adjustment. Morrison Trust, $1,800, filing fee correction. Chin Probate, $3,200, administrative cost revision. Page after page of what looked like legitimate legal fees, except I recognized some of those names from David's conversations about his mother's work. Mrs. Chen had been David's 3rd-grade teacher. He'd mentioned that Margaret was helping her with a simple will, pro bono. There shouldn't have been any probate fees, let alone $3,200 worth. I photographed every page with my phone, my hand steadying as the scope of Margaret's theft became clear. This wasn't opportunistic skimming, it was systematic fraud spanning years, targeting elderly clients who trusted her with their life savings. The final entry was dated 3 days ago. Richardson Emergency Fund, $5,000, Crisis Intervention Services. Richardson. My last name. Margaret had been so confident, so thorough in destroying my life, that she'd actually billed someone for the service. I stared at that final entry until the words blurred together. Richardson Emergency Fund, $5,000, Crisis Intervention Services. Margaret had stolen $5,000 from someone and labeled it after me, after destroying Cooper. My phone buzzed. David. Asterisk, how are you feeling tonight? I know this week has been hard. Asterisk. Hard. I was standing in his mother's office, photographing evidence that she'd been defrauding elderly clients for years, and he thought this week had been hard because I was sad about my dead dog. I kept photographing pages, my anger sharpening my focus. The ledger went back to 2019, right around the time Margaret had bought her house. Every entry was coded like legitimate legal work, but the amounts were too round, too convenient. Real legal fees came in odd numbers, $347.50 for court filing, $892.33 for research hours. These were clean theft, $1,500, $2,200, $4,000. Behind the ledger, I found copies of forged invoices on firm letterhead. Margaret had created an entire fictional billing system, charging clients for services that didn't exist or inflating real costs by hundreds of %. Mrs. Chen's simple will had somehow generated $8,400 in fees across 6 months. But it was the folder labeled insurance claims that made my blood run cold. Inside were copies of life insurance paperwork for at least a dozen clients, along with what looked like forged power of attorney documents. Margaret had been naming herself as beneficiary or executor on policies, then filing claims when clients died. The most recent was dated 2 weeks ago. Herbert Kowalski, $25,000 policy payout, estate administration. I knew that name. David had mentioned Mr. Kowalski just last month, a sweet old man who'd been coming to the firm for help with Medicare paperwork. He died suddenly of a heart attack, no family, no one to question why his paralegal had suddenly inherited $25,000. My hands were shaking again, but not from anxiety this time. From rage. Margaret hadn't just been stealing money, she'd been preying on the most vulnerable people, elderly clients who trusted her completely. People who had no one else to advocate for them. The security guard's radio crackled in the hallway, and I froze. Footsteps echoed past Margaret's office, then faded toward the stairs. I needed to move faster. I photographed the insurance files, the forged documents, everything. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop, a manila folder with my name on it, tucked behind the others. Inside were copies of my medical records from St. Mary's Hospital. My psychiatric evaluation, my discharge summary, my emergency contact information. Everything was marked confidential patient records, with a stamp showing they'd been requested by M. Whitmore, legal representative. Legal representative. Margaret had somehow gotten access to my private medical files by claiming to represent me legally. The request was dated the day after I'd been admitted, the same day she'd taken Cooper's collar off and driven him to animal control. A yellow sticky note was attached to my diagnosis page, with Margaret's handwriting, * severe PTSD, suicidal ideation, multiple hospitalizations. Recommend 72-hour hold extension plus involuntary commitment evaluation, *. She hadn't just killed Cooper. She tried to have me locked up indefinitely. The last document in my file was a draft letter on firm letterhead, addressed to David. * Dear David. After careful review of Sarah's medical history and recent psychiatric evaluation, I must advise you to consider emergency guardianship proceedings. Her current mental state poses a significant risk to herself and others. As someone who cares deeply about your well-being, I recommend consulting with our family law division about protective custody options. The enclosed documentation should provide sufficient grounds for involuntary commitment proceedings, *. It was unsigned, undated, but the letterhead was real. Margaret had been planning to use her position at the firm to convince David that I was too mentally unstable to make my own decisions. She wanted him to have me committed permanently. My phone buzzed again. Another text from David, * Mom just asked if you'd be willing to meet for coffee tomorrow. She really wants to apologize about the misunderstanding, *. Misunderstanding. I was holding evidence that his mother had committed insurance fraud, medical records theft, and conspiracy, and she wanted to apologize over coffee. I photographed everything in my file, then carefully returned all the folders to their exact positions. Margaret's obsessive organization would work against her if anything seemed out of place. The elevator dinged as I reached the lobby, and my heart stopped. Through the glass doors, I could see Margaret's BMW pulling into the parking lot, 3 hours earlier than she should have been. The charity gala was supposed to run until midnight. I ducked behind the security desk as her headlights swept across the lobby windows. Frank, is there a back exit? I whispered to the guard. He looked confused. Loading docks around back, but... Emergency, I said, already moving. Margaret can't know I was here. Client confidentiality issue. Frank nodded like this made perfect sense and buzzed me through a side door that led to the building's rear exit. I slipped out just as I heard Margaret's heels clicking across the lobby floor behind me. My hands were still shaking as I sat in my car 2 blocks away, scrolling through the photos on my phone. 47 images of Margaret's crimes, documented in her own handwriting. But seeing that BMW in the parking lot had rattled me more than I wanted to admit. If she'd caught me in her office. My phone rang. David. Sarah, thank God you picked up. There was an incident at Mom's gala tonight. I kept my voice steady. What kind of incident? Someone called in an anonymous tip to the police about financial irregularities at her firm. They showed up at the country club and started asking questions about client trust accounts and missing funds. My stomach clenched. That's terrible. What did she tell them? She came home furious. Says it's obviously a disgruntled former client trying to cause trouble, but the firm's senior partners are freaking out. They've scheduled an emergency meeting Monday morning to review all the paralegal's case files. Perfect. The state bar complaint I'd researched was unnecessary, someone else had already started the ball rolling. Margaret's years of theft were about to catch up with her. How is she handling it? I asked, genuinely curious. She's blaming you, actually. Me? She thinks you reported her out of spite about Cooper. She keeps saying the timing is too convenient, that you're trying to destroy her career because you're unstable and vindictive. Unstable and vindictive. The same words from her draft letter about having me committed. David, that's insane. I've been home grieving my dead dog. When would I have had time to investigate your mother's finances? I know. I told her she was being paranoid. But she's convinced you're behind this somehow. She even asked if you'd ever been to her office. I chose my words carefully. I've never set foot in that building. You know, I've never even met her coworkers. That's what I said. Look, I think she's just panicking because the investigation could affect her job. She's worked so hard to build her reputation there. Build her reputation by stealing from elderly clients, but I didn't say that. What happens next? The partners hired an external auditing firm to review all client accounts going back 5 years. If there really are irregularities, they'll find them. But honestly, I can't imagine Mom doing anything unethical. She's the most honest person I know. The most honest person he knew had forged power of attorney documents and stolen at least $150,000 based on what I'd seen in her ledger. But David's capacity for denial where his mother was concerned had always been impressive. I should probably stay away from her until this blows over, I said. The last thing she needs is more stress. Actually, she wants to see you tomorrow. She's convinced that if you two just talk, she can prove she had nothing to do with Cooper's collar going missing. She even said she'd pay for a new therapy dog if it would help. A new therapy dog. Like Cooper was a broken appliance she could replace with a gift card apology. I'll think about it, I lied. After I hung up, I sat in my car reviewing the photos I'd taken. The Richardson entry in Margaret's ledger suddenly made perfect sense. She'd charged someone $5,000 for crisis intervention services because she genuinely believed that destroying my support system was a professional service worth billing. But someone else reporting her financial crimes complicated things. If the auditors found her theft, Margaret would face criminal charges regardless of what I did. She'd lose her job, probably go to prison, and David would finally see who his mother really was. It should have felt like victory. Instead, I felt oddly cheated. I'd wanted to be the one to expose her, to prove that the weak, unstable girl she'd tormented for years was stronger than she'd ever imagined. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, * we need to talk. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Riverside Park. Come alone. Margaret *. She'd gotten my number from David, obviously. But why meet in person? Why not just continue the charade of concerned mother-in-law worried about her son's unstable girlfriend? Unless she suspected I knew more than I was letting on. I stared at the message, weighing my options. Meeting Margaret alone was probably stupid. She was desperate now, cornered, and desperate people did unpredictable things. But it was also an opportunity to look her in the eye and watch her lie about Cooper's collar one more time. I typed back, * fine. Bring the collar, *. Her response came immediately, what collar? Even now, even facing a fraud investigation that could destroy her life, Margaret Whitmore was still pretending she didn't know what happened to my dog's identification. I smiled for the first time in days and typed, * Cooper's collar. The one you removed before taking him to animal control. Bring it, or don't bother showing up, *. This time, she didn't respond. The next morning, I woke to find David's side of the bed empty and cold. A note on his pillow read, * emergency meeting at the firm. Mom's in full panic mode. Back tonight. Love you, *. I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from unknown numbers, all between midnight and 2 a.m. No voicemails, but the message was clear, Margaret was scrambling. At 9:15, my phone rang. This time I recognized the number from Margaret's intake form at Animal Control. Sarah? This is Margaret. We need to talk before this afternoon. Her voice was different, sharp, controlled, but with an undercurrent of something I'd never heard before. Fear. About Cooper's collar? I kept my voice light, innocent. About your accusations. David told me what you think happened, and I understand you're grieving, but these conspiracy theories are. Bring the collar to the park. If you really found Cooper without identification, you won't have it. Silence. Then, you're making a mistake, Sarah. A very serious mistake. The line went dead. I spent the morning at the downtown library, using their public computers to research Brennan, Cross & Associates. What I found was illuminating. The firm had been hemorrhaging clients for 2 years, 3 senior partners had retired early, taking their biggest accounts with them. The remaining partners were struggling to maintain their Riverside address and country club memberships on a shrinking client base. Which explained why Margaret's theft had gone undetected for so long. A thriving firm might notice missing money, but a desperate one might overlook irregularities if their most reliable paralegal kept assuring them everything was handled properly. At 1:45 p.m., I drove to Riverside Park and chose a bench near the playground with clear sightlines in every direction. Margaret's BMW pulled into the parking lot exactly at 2 o'clock, punctual as always. She walked toward me carrying a small paper bag, her usual confident stride replaced by something more cautious. Even from a distance, I could see the strain in her face. The charity gala disaster had aged her overnight. Sarah. She sat on the opposite end of the bench, the paper bag clutched in her lap. Margaret. I kept my voice neutral. You look tired. It's been a difficult 24 hours, as I'm sure you know. Interesting phrasing. As if I should know details about her night. David mentioned some trouble at your firm. Anonymous complaints? Her eyes narrowed slightly. Yes. Very convenient timing, don't you think? Right after our family experienced this unfortunate misunderstanding about your dog. Cooper had a name. Of course. Cooper. She said it like she was tasting something unpleasant. Which brings me to why we're here. She held out the paper bag. You wanted this back. Inside was Cooper's collar, his beautiful blue leather collar with his name tag, my phone number, and his therapy dog certification card still attached. Everything intact, exactly as I'd left it on him a week ago. My hands trembled as I held it. The leather still smelled like him. Where did you find this? My voice came out steadier than I felt. In my garden shed. After I brought Cooper to animal control, I realized I still had his collar in my car. I'd removed it because it was covered in mud and burrs. I didn't want him to get tangled on something at the shelter. The lie was smooth, rehearsed. If I hadn't seen her signature on that intake form, hadn't heard Jessica read Margaret's own words about Cooper being a stray with no identification, I might have believed it. You told animal control he had no identification. I made a mistake in my distress. I was so worried about getting him somewhere safe that I forgot about the collar in my car. For 5 days. You forgot for 5 days while he was scheduled for euthanization. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. I've already explained this to David. Cooper got loose somehow. Stop. I stood up, clutching his collar against my chest. Just stop lying. I understand you're upset. You murdered my therapy dog because you wanted to prove I was too weak to deserve your son. And when that didn't break me fast enough, you tried to have me committed. Margaret went very still. I have no idea what you're talking about. My medical records. The ones you illegally obtained by claiming to be my legal representative. The draft letter recommending David seek emergency guardianship. Her face went white. You've been in my office. Not a question. A statement. Margaret Whitmore was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. Prove it, I said. Margaret's eyes flicked toward the parking lot, then back to me. She was calculating something, weighing her options like she did with her carefully coded ledger entries. You're bluffing, she said finally. Building security would have records of anyone entering after hours. I almost smiled. Would they? Frank seemed pretty relaxed about people working late. Especially when they're helping Margaret Whitmore with her urgent case files. Her jaw tightened. Even if you somehow got into the building, which I'm not admitting, you'd need my keycard. And my office key. Your office key that you keep taped under your desk drawer? Really, Margaret, for someone who steals from elderly clients for a living, your security habits are surprisingly naive. The words hit their mark. Margaret's carefully maintained composure shattered completely. Those files are privileged attorney work product. Anything you think you saw? Herbert Kowalski's life insurance payout. $25,000 for estate administration when he had no family and specifically told David he wanted everything donated to the animal shelter. I kept my voice conversational, watching her face drain of color. Mrs. Chen's probate fees. Mr. Pemberton's consulting adjustments. Should I keep going? Margaret stood abruptly, her purse sliding off her lap and spilling contents across the park path. Among the scattered items, I spotted a small black notebook, the same one she'd been writing in at the bank. We both reached for it simultaneously, but I was faster. The notebook fell open in my hands to a page dated yesterday. * emergency protocols. SR knows about office files. Containment options limited. Consider leveraging medical history for credibility concerns. * SR Sarah Richardson. Me. Containment options? I looked up at her. What exactly were you planning to contain, Margaret? She snatched the notebook back, but the damage was done. You have no idea what you're interfering with. That firm is my life's work. That firm is where you've been stealing from people who trusted you. People like Mrs. Chen, who baked cookies for David's entire third-grade class. People like Mr. Kowalski, who just wanted help understanding his Medicare paperwork. Those clients received excellent service. Those clients are dead, Margaret. Conveniently dead, right around the time you filed insurance claims naming yourself as beneficiary. The accusation hung between us. I'd only seen evidence of financial theft in her files, but the pattern was suspicious. Too many elderly clients dying shortly after updating their policies with Margaret's help. You don't know what you're talking about. But her voice lacked conviction now. David will never believe these wild accusations from someone who's been institutionalized for mental instability. David's going to believe the external auditors his firm just hired. They'll find your ledger, your forged invoices, your insurance fraud. And when they do, I'll make sure they know about Cooper too. Margaret's face hardened. Cooper was an animal. This is about human lives, careers, families. Cooper was my family. I stood up, still clutching his collar. He was the only thing that kept me functional after Emma died, and you murdered him to prove a point. I saved David from a lifetime of managing your psychological episodes. That dog was enabling your dependence. That dog was prescribed by my psychiatrist as medical equipment, you vindictive bitch. The words came out louder than I'd intended. A mother pushing her toddler on the nearby swings looked over with concern. Margaret noticed too, and her expression shifted to something calculating. Help, she called out, loud enough for the other park visitors to hear. This woman is threatening me. She's been stalking my family. The playground mother started walking toward us, phone already in hand. Margaret was playing her final card, painting me as the unstable one, the dangerous one. But I'd learned something important in the past week. I was stronger than Margaret had ever given me credit for. Call 911, I told the approaching woman. This woman has been embezzling from elderly clients at Brennan, Cross and Associates. I have evidence. Margaret's eyes went wide. She hadn't expected me to double down. The woman looked between us uncertainly. Maybe I should call the police. Please do, I said, pulling out my phone. I'll call them myself. I dialed 911 while Margaret stood frozen, watching her carefully constructed world crumble in real time. The playground mother had backed away, ushering her toddler toward the parking lot, but not before I heard her whisper into her own phone, need someone at Riverside Park, 2 women arguing about embezzlement. 911, what's your emergency? I need to report financial elder abuse at Brennan, Cross and Associates law firm. I have documentation of systematic theft from client accounts by paralegal Margaret Whitmore. Margaret made a desperate lunge for my phone, but I stepped back easily. The suspect is currently with me at Riverside Park and has just attempted to interfere with my emergency call. Ma'am, are you in immediate danger? I looked at Margaret, whose face had gone from white to gray. She was clutching her chest, breathing heavily. For a moment I wondered if she was having a heart attack, but her eyes were still sharp, still calculating. I don't believe so, but she's exhibiting erratic behavior. Units are being dispatched to your location. Please stay on the line. Margaret seemed to realize that running wasn't an option. Instead, she sat back down on the bench and opened her purse with shaking hands, pulling out her phone. David? It's Mom. I need you to come to Riverside Park immediately. Her voice had taken on a trembling quality that I'd never heard before. Sarah is here making wild accusations, and she's called the police. I think she's having some kind of psychotic break. Even from 3 feet away, I could hear David's voice through the speaker. What? Mom, slow down, what's happening? She claims she broke into my office somehow. She's talking about client files, making up stories about insurance fraud. David, I'm scared. She seems completely disconnected from reality. I had to admire the performance. If I hadn't spent the last week documenting her crimes, I might have questioned my own sanity listening to her trembling, terrified voice. She is Cooper's caller, Margaret continued, and I saw her strategy crystallizing. She says I had it all along, but David, that's impossible. We both know she's been deteriorating since leaving the hospital. The 911 operator was still on my line. Ma'am, officers are approximately 3 minutes away. Can you describe the other person involved? Margaret Whitmore, 64 years old, driving a silver BMW. I rattled off her license plate number from memory, one advantage of obsessive preparation. She's currently attempting to manipulate my husband into believing I'm having a psychiatric emergency. Margaret's head snapped up at that. She hadn't realized I was still connected to emergency services. David, she's telling the 911 operator that I'm manipulating you. Do you hear how paranoid she sounds? Margaret's voice got louder, clearly intended for my phone's microphone. Sarah, honey, you need help. Let me call Dr. Peterson for you. Dr. Peterson was my psychiatrist. Of course Margaret knew his name. She'd illegally obtained my complete medical file. I heard David's car door slam through Margaret's phone speaker. I'm 5 minutes away. Mom, just stay calm and don't engage with her until I get there. Don't engage with me? I looked at Margaret with genuine amazement. I'm not the one who's been stealing from senior citizens for 3 years. Margaret covered her phone's microphone and hissed, you have no proof of anything. Those files are protected by attorney-client privilege, and even if you photographed them, they'd be inadmissible in court. Maybe. But they'll be very admissible in the state bar disciplinary hearing. And the IRS audit. And the criminal fraud investigation that your firm's external auditors are about to trigger. For the first time since we'd sat down, Margaret looked genuinely afraid. The external audit was supposed to be routine. Was it? Because someone called in a very specific tip about irregularities in your client trust accounts. Someone who knew exactly which files to flag for investigation. Margaret stared at me. You called in the tip. Prove it. 2 police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, followed immediately by David's Accord. I watched him get out, his face a mask of confusion and worry as he tried to process the scene, his mother clutching her phone like a lifeline, me holding Cooper's collar, uniformed officers approaching with hands resting casually on their service weapons. The lead officer was a woman in her 40s with graying temples and tired eyes. I'm Officer Martinez. We received reports of a disturbance and possible financial crimes? That would be me, I said, raising my hand slightly. I called to report systematic embezzlement by Margaret Whitmore at Brennan, Cross and Associates law firm. Sarah, please, David said, reaching us at a near jog. What's going on? Mom said you're making accusations about her work? Officer Martinez looked between the 3 of us. Ma'am, she addressed Margaret. Are you Margaret Whitmore? I am, and I want to file a complaint about this woman's harassment. She's been following me, making threatening phone calls, and now she's spreading malicious lies about my professional conduct. Margaret's voice had steadied, taking on the authoritative tone she used when explaining legal procedures to David's family. What specific threats were made? Officer Martinez had her notebook out. She broke into my office building last night and stole confidential client information. She's using that information to make false accusations about my handling of estate funds. David looked at me with growing alarm. Sarah, you didn't actually go to Mom's office, did you? The moment of truth. I could lie, claim I'd never been in that building, stick to my story about anonymous tips and public records. Or I could own what I'd done and let the evidence speak for itself. I have photographs of Margaret's personal financial ledger documenting 3 years of theft from elderly clients, I said clearly. I also have copies of forged insurance documents and illegally obtained medical records, including my own psychiatric files that she requested under false pretenses. Margaret's face went completely pale. Those photographs would be inadmissible. But very interesting to investigators, Officer Martinez said, looking at me with new attention. Ma'am, are you saying you unlawfully entered a private office? I'm saying I obtained evidence of ongoing crimes against vulnerable elderly people. Evidence that's about to be discovered by court-ordered auditors anyway. David was staring at me like I'd sprouted wings. Sarah, this isn't like you. Breaking into offices, making accusations. Are you sure you're thinking clearly? And there it was. Even faced with my detailed accusations, even hearing me describe specific evidence, David's first instinct was to question my mental state rather than his mother's integrity. Officer Martinez seemed to sense the family dynamics at play. Why don't we all take a step back here? Actually, Officer Martinez said, closing her notebook, I think we need to separate everyone and get individual statements. This is getting complicated fast. She gestured to her partner, a younger male officer who'd been quietly observing. Officer Chen, can you take Mrs. Whitmore over to Unit 2? I'll speak with the caller here. Wait, Margaret said quickly. Before we do that, I think everyone should know that Sarah was just released from psychiatric care 6 days ago. She's been experiencing severe paranoid episodes, and her doctor specifically warned about potential violent outbursts. I felt my face flush hot. That's information from my private medical records that you obtained illegally. David told me about your hospitalization because he was worried. David told you I was hospitalized. He didn't tell you my specific diagnosis or doctor's recommendations because he doesn't have access to those details. But you do, because you forged a legal representative request to St. Mary's Hospital. Officer Martinez held up her hand. Ma'am, do you have evidence of this medical records theft? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the photographs I'd taken in Margaret's office. Photo 43 shows the request form with her forged signature claiming to represent me legally. Photos 44 through 47 show my complete psychiatric evaluation, including treatment recommendations that were never shared with my husband. Margaret's mouth opened and closed silently. David looked between us with growing confusion. Sarah, he said slowly, how would you know which photo numbers those are unless you really did break into Mom's office? Because I spent 3 hours last night cataloging evidence of her crimes. Your mother has been stealing from elderly clients, David. Systematically. 4 years. I turned to Officer Martinez. Herbert Kowalski, deceased 3 weeks ago. Margaret filed a $25,000 insurance claim naming herself as beneficiary, claiming estate administration fees. That's a legitimate legal service, Margaret started. For a client who specifically told David he wanted everything donated to the animal shelter. No family, no estate to administer. Just a lonely old man who trusted the wrong paralegal with his final wishes. Officer Martinez was writing again. Sir, she addressed David. Did your client Mr. Kowalski mention those donation intentions to you? David nodded reluctantly. He did say something about leaving everything to animals because people had disappointed him. But Mom handles all the estate paperwork. I assumed she'd filed everything correctly. She filed it correctly for herself, I said. $25,000 deposited into her personal account at First National Bank on Maple Street. I watched her make the deposit Thursday evening. Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. You've been following me? David, she's been stalking me for days. I've been documenting your patterns because I knew you'd lie about Cooper. I held up his collar, the tags catching sunlight. This collar that you somehow found in your garden shed after telling animal control he was a stray with no identification. Officer Martinez looked at the collar, then at Margaret. Ma'am, can you explain the discrepancy about the animal's identification? I made an honest mistake in my distress. You made 5 separate statements to animal control about finding a stray dog with no collar or tags. That's not a mistake, that's perjury on government documents. David was staring at his mother now, really looking at her for the first time. Mom, did you take Cooper's collar off before bringing him to the shelter? The silence stretched too long. Margaret glanced between David and the officers, calculating her final play. That animal was a crutch, she said finally. Sarah was becoming completely dependent, using her so-called disability as an excuse to avoid growing up and being a proper wife. I thought if she lost that crutch temporarily, she might finally develop some real strength. The admission hung in the air like smoke. David's face went completely blank. Officer Martinez clicked her pen. Ma'am, are you stating that you intentionally removed identification from a therapy animal before surrendering it to animal control? I'm stating that I tried to help my daughter-in-law become self-sufficient. By having her prescribed medical equipment destroyed. Margaret's eyes flashed with the old venom. By forcing her to stop wallowing in victimhood and... Mom. David's voice was very quiet. Cooper is dead. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. All her justifications, all her careful explanations about helping me become self-sufficient, they crumbled against that simple truth. Cooper was dead. Not temporarily relocated, not waiting to be reclaimed. Dead. I didn't know they would, she started, then stopped. You knew exactly what would happen, I said. 5 days is standard hold time for strays. You've lived in this county for 20 years. Officer Martinez was writing steadily now. Mrs. Whitmore, interfering with a prescribed medical device is a criminal offense. In this case, it resulted in the destruction of that device. It was just a dog. The words burst out of Margaret before she could stop them, raw and ugly. David stepped backward like she'd slapped him. Just a dog? Mom, you know what Cooper meant to Sarah. You've seen her panic attacks. Those attacks are psychological manipulation. Those attacks are documented PTSD from watching her sister die, David said, his voice rising. Cooper wasn't enabling weakness, he was preventing Sarah from, he stopped abruptly, glancing at me. From killing myself. He'd been about to say it, the thing we never talked about directly. How many times Cooper had woken me from nightmares before they became full spirals. How his weight against my chest had anchored me during flashbacks when the world tilted sideways and Emma's voice echoed in my head. Margaret saw the opportunity. See? Even David knows how unstable you are. That's exactly why I was preparing guardianship paperwork, to protect everyone involved. You were preparing what? David turned to stare at his mother. Officer Martinez looked up from her notes. Ma'am, did you prepare legal documents without your daughter-in-law's knowledge or consent? I drafted a consultation letter recommending that David explore legal options for Sarah's protection during psychiatric crisis episodes. Margaret's voice had taken on that clipped, professional tone she used when explaining complex legal procedures. It's standard practice in elder law when clients become incapacitated. I'm 28 years old, I said. Not elderly, not incapacitated. You were just hospitalized for suicidal ideation. Information you obtained by committing medical records fraud, Officer Martinez interrupted. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to need you to come to the station to answer some additional questions. Margaret's eyes went wide. I haven't been charged with anything. This is all hearsay and speculation. We've got admission to animal cruelty, potential medical fraud, and now allegations of financial crimes. Plus whatever evidence MS, she looked at me. Richardson. Plus whatever evidence Ms. Richardson photographed in your office. Officer Martinez closed her notebook. Sir, she addressed David, you might want to contact an attorney for your mother. David looked shell-shocked. I don't understand any of this. Mom, the client trust accounts, Sarah's saying you stole money from people like Mrs. Chen? Margaret's composure was completely gone now. Those were legitimate administrative adjustments. Every firm handles estate costs differently. Mrs. Chen's will was pro bono, David said slowly. You told me yourself it was a simple document, no charge because she couldn't afford legal fees. There were unexpected complications. $3,200 worth of complications for a basic will? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the relevant photo. Or was that the cost of your new kitchen backsplash? Officer Martinez stepped between us. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to put your phone away for now. This is becoming evidence in a criminal investigation. Criminal investigation. The words seemed to hit Margaret harder than anything else we'd said. She swayed slightly, gripping the park bench. David, she whispered, you have to believe me. Everything I've done has been to protect our family. Sarah's illness, her dependency, it was destroying your future. My future? David's voice was very quiet. Mom, you killed her therapy dog. You tried to have her committed. You've been stealing from elderly clients for years. He shook his head. What future were you protecting? Margaret reached for him, but he stepped back. For the first time in 4 years, David Whitmore was seeing his mother clearly. And what he saw there wasn't protecting anyone. The next morning brought a development I hadn't expected. I was sitting at my kitchen table, still holding Cooper's collar and trying to process everything that had happened at the park, when my phone rang. Unknown number. Ms. Richardson? This is Detective Angela Foster with the Financial Crimes Unit. I understand you have information about irregularities at Brennan, Cross and Associates. My stomach dropped. Officer Martinez said you might call. Actually, we've been investigating that firm for 6 weeks now. Your incident yesterday has accelerated our timeline significantly. I heard papers rustling. Would you be available to come in this afternoon? We'd like to review those photographs you mentioned. 6 weeks. They'd been investigating Margaret for 6 weeks, which meant someone else had reported her long before I'd even gotten out of the hospital. What kind of timeline are we talking about? Well, that depends on what your evidence shows. But Mrs. Whitmore has been placed on administrative leave pending our investigation. The firm's partners are cooperating fully. After I hung up, I found David sitting in his car in our parking lot, staring at his phone. He'd been there for 20 minutes. I'd watched him from the window, not sure if I was ready for the conversation we needed to have. I knocked on his passenger window. He unlocked the doors without looking up. The firm called, he said as I slid into the seat. Mom's been suspended. They've frozen all client trust accounts and brought in forensic accountants. How are you doing with all this? He laughed bitterly. My mother has been stealing from elderly people for years, and I never noticed. She murdered your therapy dog out of spite. She tried to have you declared mentally incompetent. He finally looked at me. How do you think I'm doing? I think you're probably questioning everything you thought you knew about her. I called Mrs. Chen this morning, he said quietly. Told her there might be irregularities with her billing. You know what she said? She said she'd been worried about those fees but didn't want to question my mother because Margaret had been so helpful about everything. I waited. Mrs. Chen paid $8,000 for a simple will, Sarah. $8,000 she didn't have, that she borrowed against her house to pay. Because she trusted us. Because she trusted my family. The guilt in his voice was devastating. David, you didn't know. Didn't I? Mom's house, her car, her spending habits, I never asked where the money was coming from. I just assumed she was good at managing her finances. He shook his head. Maybe I didn't want to know. There's something else, I said carefully. The detective mentioned they'd been investigating for 6 weeks. Someone reported her before I ever got involved. David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his face went white. It's Mom. She wants to meet. Don't. She's at the Riverside Diner. Says she has things to explain before the police interview her again. I looked at him seriously. David, she's probably going to try to manipulate you into providing an alibi or character testimony. Don't let her drag you down with her. She's still my mother. Your mother tried to destroy my life and stole from people who trusted her. Whatever explanation she has isn't going to change those facts. But I could see he was wavering. Margaret had been pulling his strings for 35 years. It would take more than one devastating day to break those patterns completely. If you go, I said, I'm coming with you. Sarah, I don't think that's. She killed Cooper, David. She tried to have me committed. If you're going to listen to her side of the story, then I'm going to be there to remind you what her side actually cost. David stared at his phone for a long moment, then started the engine. Riverside Diner. But we're not staying long. As we drove toward what I knew would be Margaret's final attempt to salvage her relationship with her son, I wondered if she'd finally realize the true cost of her vindictive campaign against me. She hadn't just lost her career and freedom, she'd lost David's faith in her forever. The Riverside Diner was nearly empty at 3 in the afternoon, just Margaret sitting alone in a corner booth with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it was anchoring her to reality. She looked up when we walked in, and I was startled by how much she'd aged overnight. Her usually perfect makeup was gone, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her expensive blazer wrinkled. David, thank God. She started to stand, then seemed to remember I was there. Her face hardened slightly. Sarah. I suppose you insisted on coming. I insisted on protecting my husband from more manipulation, I said, sliding into the booth across from her. David hesitated, then sat beside me instead of next to his mother. Margaret noticed the seating choice. Her mouth tightened. I see you've already made your decision about me. Mom, I've spent the last 18 hours trying to understand how this happened. Help me understand. She pulled a manila envelope from her purse and slid it across the table. These are the real client files. The ones that show exactly what services I provided and why the fees were justified. David opened the envelope. Inside were photocopies of invoices, timesheets, and billing statements that looked nothing like the documents I'd photographed in Margaret's office. These showed reasonable fees, normal legal services, everything properly documented. This is very thorough, David said slowly, flipping through pages. But Sarah said she saw different records in your office. Sarah broke into my office in the middle of a mental health crisis and photographed preliminary draft documents, Margaret said, her voice taking on that patient, explaining to children tone. Those drafts contained errors, inflated estimates, worst-case scenario billing projections. I was working late at the gala because I needed to finalize the correct versions. I stared at her. Even now, even facing criminal charges, Margaret was trying to gaslight her way out of this. These documents are dated yesterday, I pointed out, checking the timestamps. 12 hours after I photographed your real ledger. The timestamps reflect when I printed the final versions from my computer files, Margaret replied smoothly. The actual billing work was completed weeks ago. David looked between us uncertainly. Mom, the police seem to think there's real evidence of financial irregularities. The police are responding to anonymous accusations from someone with documented mental health issues. Once the forensic accountants review my actual files, they'll see that every penny is accounted for. She was good. If I hadn't seen that ledger with my own eyes, hadn't photographed her handwritten entries about charging someone $5,000 for destroying my life, I might have started doubting myself. What about Cooper? I asked quietly. Margaret's composure flickered. What about him? David asked you a direct question yesterday. Did you remove his collar before taking him to animal control? I explained yesterday that his collar was muddy. That's not what I asked. Did you deliberately remove his identification so animal control would classify him as a stray? The silence stretched. David was watching his mother's face carefully, and I could see him cataloging the micro-expressions, the hesitation, the way her eyes shifted toward the window. Cooper was making you weaker, she said finally. You were using him as an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for your own healing. Sometimes people need to lose their crutches before they can learn to walk. He wasn't a crutch, David said, his voice very quiet. He was prescribed medical equipment. He was an animal that enabled. He was her lifeline, Mom. David's voice was getting louder. And you killed him to make a point. Margaret's mask slipped completely. That animal was turning you into a caregiver instead of a husband. She was using her so-called trauma to manipulate you into. Stop. David stood up abruptly. Just stop talking. He walked out of the diner without another word, leaving Margaret and me alone in the booth. Through the window, I could see him pacing beside his car, phone pressed to his ear. You destroyed my family, Margaret said, her voice venomous now that David was gone. I documented your crimes. You destroyed your own family when you decided that murdering my dog was acceptable collateral damage in your campaign to control David's life. This isn't over. I smiled and pulled out my phone, showing her the recording app that had been running since we'd sat down. Actually, it is. You just admitted on tape that you deliberately killed Cooper to manipulate my relationship with your son. The DA is going to love that confession. Margaret's face went completely white. You can't record someone without consent in this state. Actually, I can. Single-party consent law. I consented to recording my own conversation. I stopped the recording and saved it with a timestamp. Thanks for the confession, Margaret. That should wrap up any lingering questions about your intent. As I walked out to join David, I heard Margaret's coffee cup shatter against the diner floor behind me. 3 months later, I stood in the courthouse hallway holding a folder thick with victim impact statements. Margaret's sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m., and the elderly clients she'd stolen from had written pages about how her betrayal had affected their lives. Mrs. Chen's statement was particularly heartbreaking. I trusted her with my life savings because she seemed so professional, so caring. Now I don't know if I can ever trust anyone again. David appeared beside me, looking exhausted. The divorce papers had been finalized last week, not because of anger, but because we'd both realized that our relationship had been built around managing his mother's manipulation for so long that we didn't know who we were without it. How many clients total? He asked, nodding toward my folder. 14 confirmed victims. Total theft of $247,000 over 4 years. I flipped through the statements. The Kowalski insurance fraud alone was enough for felony charges, but apparently she'd been forging beneficiary documents since 2020. The courtroom doors opened, and Margaret emerged flanked by her public defender. She'd aged dramatically over the past 3 months. Her hair was completely gray now, her expensive clothes replaced by an ill-fitting navy suit. When she saw David, her face crumpled. David, please. I know you're angry, but I'm still your mother. No, he said quietly. My mother wouldn't have stolen from Mrs. Chen's grocery money to pay for kitchen renovations. My mother wouldn't have murdered an innocent animal out of spite. Margaret's lawyer touched her elbow, steering her toward the defendant's table. As they passed me, she leaned close enough to whisper, You destroyed everything. You destroyed everything, I corrected. I just documented it. The hearing itself was mercifully quick. Margaret's plea deal, 5 years in prison, full restitution to victims, lifetime ban from legal work, had already been negotiated. Judge Morrison simply needed to make it official. Mrs. Whitmore, the judge said, your betrayal of these elderly clients represents one of the most callous examples of financial elder abuse I've seen. These were people who trusted you with their life savings, their final wishes, their most vulnerable moments. Margaret stood with her head down, not speaking. The court also notes the particularly disturbing pattern of targeting isolated elderly individuals and positioning yourself as their primary legal advocate while systematically defrauding them. Judge Morrison consulted his notes. In the case of Herbert Kowalski specifically, you filed fraudulent insurance claims within hours of his death. I glanced at David, whose hands were clenched in his lap. Learning about Mr. Kowalski's insurance fraud had been the final straw for him. Margaret had literally profited from an old man's funeral. Additionally, the court has reviewed evidence of your interference with Ms. Richardson's prescribed medical equipment, which directly resulted in the destruction of her therapy animal. The judge's voice hardened. Using someone's disability as a weapon is unconscionable. Margaret finally looked up. Your Honor, I was trying to help. You were trying to control. Judge Morrison cut her off. 5 years in state prison, Mrs. Whitmore. Restitution of $247,000 to be paid through liquidation of your assets. Lifetime prohibition from any legal or financial services work. The gavel came down with finality. As the bailiff led Margaret away in handcuffs, she looked back at David one last time. I love you, she mouthed. David stared straight ahead, not responding. Outside the courthouse, we sat on the steps in comfortable silence. The late afternoon sun was warm, and for the first time in months, I felt something like peace. So what now? David asked eventually. I pulled Cooper's collar from my purse. I'd carried it every day since getting it back. Now I'm getting a new therapy dog. A rescue, probably. Someone who needs a second chance as much as I do. David smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since this whole nightmare began. Cooper would have liked that. Yeah, I said, watching Margaret's BMW get towed from the courthouse parking lot. He really would have.